Do we really need a lot of theory? I'm pretty sure that you would say yes, although I've seen some students from our psychotherapy programs who said, I'm a radical phenomenologist. I'm not going to read any theory until I talk to individuals and until I arrive at some findings. But unfortunately, this strategy is not a very good one, because even in order to understand what kind of questions do you need to ask to people, or how you should actually interpret your data, you already need to have some review of existing studies. You need to understand how people have researched this question. But of course, there is this traditional strategy which says that theory is our starting point. And based on this theory, we find a problem, we choose what we're going to study, we do an empirical study, and we interpret the results. But of course, there is an alternative phenomenological strategy. When you start with a phenomenon, and you do your literature review to formulate your problem, and you conduct an empirical study, and based on the results of this empirical study, you may use some kind of grounded theory approach or interpretive phenomenological analysis, and based on the results of this study, you arrive at some thick description, which basically is a basis for a future theory which explains the phenomenon you're interested in. But when you use this strategy, still you need to look at existing studies, what other people have done, how they did it, in order not to repeat what already has been done. Of course, when you work as a phenomenologist with your participants, you kind of put this theoretical knowledge away. But at the initial stage and at the stage when you complete your analysis, this existing work is needed. However, different theories have different purposes. Not all theories are equally useful to inform our research. There is a higher level of theories that are extremely abstract. We would even call them philosophical theories that describe the general views of the world, the general principles of the functioning of human mind. And these theories basically define the context or our methodological basis for our work. There is a paragraph in our master's thesis which is called methodological basis. And this is where you say what context you are working in. And it can be cultural historical activity theory, or it can be Freudian psychoanalysis, or whatever it is. So it is basically a general philosophy of the world and of science. At a lower level, there is a level of medium level theories. They are typically called. These theories describe a certain reality, but they use trans-empirical terms such as superego or ego, or they introduce latent constructs, not even latent, but hypothetical constructs such as anxiety or need for achievement. And these theories can explain different types of data in very different contexts, and they allow you to generalize over different contexts. And then there is the lowest level, the level of data thesis, where we do our empirical research, and there we have some models which describe relationships between very specific variables in very specific situations. Everyone knows the models of attention, or maybe the model of planned behavior. So these are more specific theories. And when we go from the level of theory, from the level of hypothetical constructs, for example, need for achievement or aggression, when we approach the actual level of measurable variables, there is always this gap, which we call the gap of operationalization. Operationalization is basically the question of what are you going to measure? What kind of variables? How are you going to interpret these variables? What kind of conclusions are you going to make? For example, in order to operationalize need for achievement, you can use completely different approaches. You can use self-report, or you can use some projective tests, or if you have opened at some point in your life, Heinz Heckhausen's book, Motivation and Activity, he presents an example of a study where people used electricity consumption in different countries in order to operationalize the need for achievement in a country. Perhaps. So different operationalizations, sometimes they can be strange to us. But these are basically different ways to bridge the gap between the hypothetical constructs that we want to measure, such as needs or some other processes, and measurable variables. Measurable variables which are related to our specific data points and which can be measured directly, for example, a score on a questionnaire, or which can be latent when we use, for example, several questionnaires and we conduct factor analysis to create a more precise measurement based on several observed variables. But we'll talk about this later on in our course. The danger of theories is that some of the terms that are used in those theories are trans-empirical terms. They are not really related to specific measurable variables. As an example of such a trans-empirical term, we can think of the term personality. Our common sense defines personality as a human or a human being, but then in science it can be used in very different ways. Sometimes, typically in English language discourse, we use the term personality to refer to the combination of all individual differences, such as temperament or traits, attitudes, and so on. But a specific personality theory may actually define this term in a more narrow sense. For example, Freud would define personality as a combination of different psychodynamic processes, or in trait theories, personality is defined as a combination of traits, or Leontiev in his activity theory would define personality as ways we use what nature and what society have given us. So the best way to summarize it is to remember Raymond Kettle's pun. He said, personality is like love. Everyone knows that it is, but no one knows what it is exactly. So personality is not a data term. It is a trans-empirical term or a meta-psychological category, and it needs some theory to define it. So when you say personality, this is meaningless without a reference to a theoretical context, for example, Freudian psychoanalysis or activity theory. And this context you mention in your methodological basis paragraph of your master's dissertation. And then everyone who reads your master's dissertation understands what context should we use to interpret your statements about personality. Another problem that we encounter at this stage is the danger of everyday language. Our everyday language and our scientific language don't really fit with each other well. We know it pretty well in philosophy. Different philosophers, when they say, for example, a thought, they may have completely different ideas about it, and you may not be aware of it until you start really delving into this theory. The same thing with psychology. First of all, the same term of common language can denote very different psychological processes. When people say love, one person can think of genuine love in terms of from. Another person might think about insecure attachment and anxiety that they feel when their partner is away. So think of a whole bunch of different psychological processes associated with the term love. And another problem, even some clearly defined scientific constructs can be expressed in many different everyday terms. For example, extroversion. There is no word in common everyday language to express it. You need to use many different words. Or sometimes people may use completely different words to refer to the same issue. So when you go from the level of theory to the level of your research procedures, when you think about how you should actually ask your questions to your participants, how you should maybe create your self-report questionnaires, you need to be very careful about this shift. You should not really trust what people say, because when they say something, you need to actually try to understand what it is that they mean what it is that they mean when they say it. In an interview, you can ask an additional question In a self-report questionnaire, obviously you cannot ask an additional question, but you can do a cognitive interview when you give your questionnaire to a bunch of people and you ask them to think aloud when they complete this questionnaire, so you can have an idea of what informs their answers. As Dmitry Leontiev says, the difference between sociologists and psychologists is that sociologists believe whatever people say, but psychologists, no, we do not. Sometimes our research questions are fairly abstract and they are not always directly testable. This is why sometimes we need to go from a research question to a more specific hypothesis. For example, instead of asking a question, what individual differences are actually associated with rubbing a dog's nose, you may formulate a bunch of specific hypotheses. Rubbing a dog's nose is associated with anxiety, extroversion, or whatever it is. What is a good hypothesis? Basically, a hypothesis is a general but a very exact, very specific statement about reality. First of all, it is formulated in scientific terms, not in terms of everyday language. It should be clear from your hypothesis what kind of procedures can be used to test it. And a hypothesis can be tested. It can be tested either by logical analysis, and then it's a theoretical hypothesis, but more often it can be tested by an empirical procedure. We collect some data, and then we can make a conclusion about the probability of our hypothesis being true. So a good hypothesis is one that can be tested. And a very good hypothesis is one where it's not really clear what the outcome of the test will be. We don't know the result from the beginning. A bad hypothesis is untestable, or maybe it's trivial. It's clear from the beginning what the result will be, so do we really want it? Meh. And when we go from our hypothesis to the level of research methods, to the level of data and specific measurement procedures, we give our concepts operational definitions. We operationalize our constructs. An operational definition of a construct is basically, how am I going to measure it? What kind of procedures am I going to use to arrive at some data that are going to give me information about this construct? And this operational definition is always much more limited compared to its theoretical definition. As a little exercise, you can think of different ways to measure aggression. If you want to measure aggression in your study, what kind of procedures would you use? And you can make a little pause and think of it. And if you have performed this little exercise, maybe you have thought of quite a whole bunch of different ways to measure aggression. You can place a rubber doll in your lab with a dynamometer inside, and you can actually ask people to beat this doll or provoke them in some way to push it, and you can measure the force with which they do it. Or you can use a self-report method, such as a direct questionnaire. Are you an aggressive person? Yeah. Or you can use some projective test, like, for example, a Rosenzweig frustration aggression test. When you give people pictures, for example, there is a car which has splashed quite a lot of water on you, and you are the person who needs to answer something to the driver of this car. And depending on whether you're an aggressive person or not, your answer might be extremely polite or completely censored. So all these different ways, they capture different aspects of aggression. And our operational definition in different studies is always more limited, is always more narrow with respect to the reality with which we are interested in. Think of this picture with some beautiful horses who run wild in nature. And these are two different ways to operationalize this concept of a horse. In the first example on top, the researcher is interested in the structure of a horse, and at the bottom, the researcher is interested more in the function of a horse. So basically, your operational definition will depend on your research question, and you need to be aware that there can be others. You need to be aware about the whole complexity and the beauty of the reality that you are actually investigating, because we are dealing with human experience. Obviously, there are different types of hypotheses that you will tend to formulate. In your study, you may have some theoretical hypothesis that you will test logically by theoretical analysis. And maybe in your work this year, when you do a course work, which is basically a review for the most part, you may formulate some theoretical hypothesis about the relationship between different theoretical concepts or and so on. Empirical hypotheses are those that concern existence of phenomena or correlation between phenomena or causal associations, and those are hypotheses we test empirically using statistical procedures. Of course, when we test these hypotheses, for example, is extroversion associated with rubbing a dog's nose, there are always statistical hypotheses involved in the process. For example, H0, there is no association, and H1, there is an association between two variables. These statistical hypotheses are very technical, and they are related to the specific statistical methods that we used. Normally, you're not going to present the statistical hypothesis in your research report because everyone knows what they sound like, they're kind of standard, but you definitely do present your empirical hypothesis. And of course, if you're conducting an exploratory study, sometimes a research question is sufficient. You don't always need hypothesis, but some people require hypothesis. There is this tendency in our scientific community to say that if there is no hypothesis, maybe this is not a good research. I don't subscribe to this view. I believe that exploratory studies don't need hypothesis. It's sufficient to formulate a research question. But when the study is confirmatory or critical, when you test a specific hypothesis, you need to formulate it. And there is a practice which is not such a good practice when people formulate their hypothesis after they get their results. And then they pretend that this was the hypothesis which I initially aimed to test. This was considered more or less okay during the most of the 20th century, but nowadays this is considered a questionable research practice, or QRP. It's called harking, hypothesizing after the results are known. In Russian, harking is like spitting. So when you do this, think of it as you're doing something very unpleasant. And when you have formulated your hypothesis, you can ask yourselves several questions. Are my hypotheses clear and unambiguous? Is it clear what I'm trying to test? Are my hypotheses testable? Is it easy to understand what kind of empirical procedure I'm going to use to test this hypothesis? Are my hypotheses grounded in a certain theoretical context? And why this one? Maybe instead of Freudian psychoanalysis, you could choose Vygotsky's cultural historical approach or something else. And the most important question when you operationalize your constructs, when you formulate your hypothesis, think, what other possibilities to operationalize this hypothesis exist? And why do you choose this one? It makes sense to brainstorm and engage with your fantasy and think creatively about all kinds of possible interesting studies, exciting studies that you would be happy to conduct if you had all the time and all the money in the world. Obviously, most of these studies will not be feasible in the context of your master's thesis, but they might give you some ideas how you can improve your chosen approach, or they might give you some ideas about the limitations of your chosen approach, and you can reflect on these limitations in your discussion of your results. And this is very important to produce a good impression of your work. So at this stage, you arrive at a bunch of questions concerning research methods. What phenomena am I going to study? What measurement procedures am I going to use? In which setting? In what sample? And all these questions can be generally called operationalization choices. There are also choices about design. What research design I'm going to use? Is it an experiment? Or is it a correlational design or longitudinal design? And this depends on how your research question is formulated. If it's causal, it would be much better to do an experiment, of course, if it's possible. And we'll discuss research designs very soon. And finally, what kind of procedure am I going to follow? What kind of protocol? and you need to describe this protocol before you actually start your study. So for the rest of our course, we will basically deal with different ways to answer these questions. And these answers you typically try to write and to justify in the methods chapter of your master's thesis. And in our course, there will be some home assignments where you can practice actually justifying your choice of research methods. So we have taken a look at the path from our research question towards our study. But this path goes through another rather complicated area, literature reviews. And for the next 20 or 30 minutes, we'll talk about different practical tips